Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Rosenberg. I'm the director of the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I welcome you this evening to this UCS conversation on the future of our democracy. I hope most of you are familiar with the Union of Concerned Scientists, but we are a national organization with 50 years of experience putting science into action to build a healthier planet and a safer world, and we hold to the principle that that healthy planet and safer world must be more equitable and just and battle racism in all its forms. We are supported by our members who give financial support to this work, and many of whom are activists along with other scientists who bring their voices and expertise to advance our policy priorities. Well, in the current context, we've had really a complete change of setting with the new administration coming in January. Rather than defending against terrible things happening, we now have an opportunity with a presidential administration that has espoused a commitment to science, to racial equity, to addressing the climate crisis, and to economic priorities, including equity, but are also putting those ideas into action. And we increasingly are finding ourselves in the position of being a resource to that administration to try to help shape those ideas, push them as far as we can in the direction of science-based policymaking. There are also important legislative initiatives that can improve people's lives, make investments that we need to address climate change, build a clean energy future, and build a just future, just transition to that clean energy future. And at states across the country, we are seeing efforts to, in some sense, turn back the clock even further than before the 2020 election and restrict and suppress voting, deliberately targeting Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And you will hear about those efforts to suppress the vote in our webinar tonight. There are also regressive efforts to prohibit an honest exploration of our country's history of racial injustice, and efforts to inhibit the ability of many other groups in the country to actually voice their concerns and have their government represent them. The Center for Science and Democracy that I have the honor to lead is the home for our work on the science of democracy, which includes voting rights and representation within our constitutional democratic system. At the Center for Science and Democracy, we advocate for the role of science. And that includes the role that science plays in shaping how we address many of the issues around justice and equity that we are confronting today and have confronted throughout the history of the country. It is not that we have large numbers that can speak out in the battle for voting rights, but what we do have is connection to the science community. And we fully believe that the science community has a role to play in providing science-based information as well as science-based solutions to many of the problems we face with regard to attacks on democracy, including those on voting rights. So this conversation tonight comes out of that work that we have engaged in around the science of democracy. It is my pleasure then to introduce our speakers for the evening. Keisha Krumm is the co-founder of the Battle for Democracy Fund and executive director of the Greater Cleveland Congregations. She has deep experience in civic and social organization, and she uses it to drive grassroots power for social justice. And she has been a great partner to help UCS work in this space. Dr. Michael Lattner is a fellow at UCS in the Center for Science and Democracy, and he is a professor of political science and public policy at Cal Polytech State University in San Luis Obispo. His work focuses on political representation and electoral systems, and he has led much of UCS's work on the science of democracy. Alex Peay is founder and executive director of One's Up, a Philadelphia-based nonprofit focused on building sustainable communities through the empowerment of young people. He works to help disadvantaged youth excel in today's world and drive change in their communities. Alejandra co-founded the Battle for Democracy Fund with Keisha. Her work is based on a rural island outside of Seattle, and she works alongside Latino grassroots organizations to engage activists and partners in developing community-led systemic change. And finally, I'm pleased to turn this conversation over to our moderator, Derrick Jackson, who is a UCS Fellow in Climate and Energy and with the Center for Science and Democracy. His posts for UCS on racial disparities in response to the COVID pandemic earned first prize last month for excellence in opinion writing in the Scripps Howard Awards. Other writings for UCS by Derrick have won awards from the National Society of Newspaper Columnists, Society for Environmental Journalists, and last week his book, The Puffin Plan, which he co-wrote with Steve Kress, won the Gold Award in Teen Nonfiction from the Independent Book Publishers Association. Derrick Jackson is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a 10-time winner of the National Association of Black Journalists Award, and was a 2016 Shorenstein Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he published a paper on the failed national media coverage of the Flint water crisis. Derrick will be leading the conversation with the panelists. He will not be taking questions over the Q&A line, but has had questions given to him before this meeting that you all submitted. You are welcome to post questions in the chat. I will do my best in the background to field them as the conversation goes along. Derrick, over to you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you to UCS for sponsoring tonight's conversation. And again, we've collected questions in advance, and we're using them to help shape this conversation tonight. It's incredibly important as the big lie of electoral fraud persists and persists and persists, and it is being used more and more as a litmus test of party loyalty and a rationale for the aggressive voter suppression tactics that Andy referenced. So I'm excited to delve into this discussion with how science, democracy, and voting connect, and so we can support each other in making it easier at the end of the day for everyone to vote. I'd like to start out with two quotes. I'm 65 years old, and the year I was born, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote this about the 1956 election. Corporate wealth profits as never before in history. We turn over the national resources for private profit to private profit and have few funds left for education, health, or housing. Sound familiar? Our crime, especially juvenile crime, is increasing. Its increase is perfectly logical. For a generation, we have been teaching our youth to kill, destroy, steal, and rape in war. What can we expect in peace? We let men take wealth which is not theirs. If the seizure is legal, we call it high profits, and the profiteers help decide what is legal. If the theft is illegal, the thief can fight it out in court with excellent chances to win if he receives the accolade of the right newspapers. Gambling at home, church, and on the stock market is increasing, and all prices are rising. It costs 3 times the salary to elect a senator and many millions to elect a president. The money comes from the very corporations, which today are the government. This, in a real democracy, would be enough to turn the party responsible for it out of power. Yet, this we cannot do. Also, in 1980, my favorite writer, James Baldwin, wrote a fairly despairing essay on voting. He said, if we are to change our children's lives and help them liberate themselves from the jails and hovels, this mortal danger in which our countrymen have placed us, the vote does not appear to be the answer. It has certainly not been the answer until now. Here one finds oneself on treacherous ground indeed. I am legally anyway, an adult, a somewhat battered survivor of this hard place, and have never expected my power to vote to have any effect whatever on my life, and it hasn't. On the other hand, I have been active in voter registration drives in the South because the acquisition of the vote there and then, and even if only for local aims, was too crucial and too profound a necessity even to be argued. Nor can it be denied that the sheer tenacity of the Black people in the South, their grace under pressure, to put it far too mildly, and the simple fact that their presence in the voting booth profoundly challenged, if it did not expose, the obscene Southern mythology. And so with that, those thoughts, we want to open the conversation. Has there been enough change that we can think differently about the vote? What is happening on the ground to defeat voter suppression? Just today, in the Hill, the newspaper that covers Congress, even the conservative, mild efforts of the most conservative, arguably the most conservative senator on the Democratic side, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, his effort to have a relatively mild voting rights extension is being rebuffed by the Republicans in Congress. As Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina said, I think the court got it right. This is just an effort to make everything about race. There is no problem to fix in South Carolina. This is a manufactured problem, making every Republican a racist. I want to be really clear that while much of the politics is done in a sort of dichotomy, a Republican, Democrat, either or thing, what we're really talking about is centuries of white supremacy that in various ways have maintained privileges and keep working to this very day to exclude people, regardless of what the party name is, to keep the participation in democracy from being the absolute maximum it can be. So with that, Keisha, what is your thought to what is happening today? And what are you doing on the ground to make sure that we do not have another generation of writers like W.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin be so despairing about the power of the vote?
Yeah. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Derrick, for the question and those really provocative quotes. And thank you, Andy and UCS, for the continued partnership that we have developed. And we're continuing to look forward to building on that relationship. So I'll start with just my own story, because I think when you read those quotes in 1956 and 1980, the first time I voted was in 2000. It was the Gore and Bush election. And those quotes resonated with my experience of what it was like growing up in Wichita, Kansas, and feeling like, while I seen my grandmother vote in every election that she could vote in, that feeling like it didn't matter for people like me. And what I've experienced now over the 20 years of my organizing, and when I really understood the lengths that, whether it's the Republicans now or the Democrats in 1877, went to take away our rights as people to vote and to limit those rights in a legal way, I really began to see that voting does matter, and that not just voting, but really participating in our democracy every day, which means really engaging people in vigorous conversations about their lived experience and how do we build power to change that. And so I get the privilege of doing that work day in and day out, of having conversations with people about the world they want to create, and then thinking about how do we build the power to change that. And so I think the way we change it honestly, I think it's through the grassroots organizing that you'll probably hear from Alex, from Alejandra, from myself. I think it's conversation by conversation, community by community, that then adds up to thinking bigger and bolder about what's our everyday experience and how do our policies then support the vision, the pain, the dreams of the everyday people in our democracy.
Thank you, Keisha. Alejandra, same to you. Same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's interesting because in some ways I came kind of late to really being invested and get out the vote work. Keisha and I met 15 years ago and organized side by side on a green jobs campaign. And it wasn't until probably about 12 years ago, I started thinking that what I loved about your quote from James Baldwin was that it was, despite his clear depression about voting, he still registers people to vote. And it wasn't actually until I started having conversations about voting with the Latino youth that I worked with that I started to see it as a way to create an imagination of what's possible. And that it was a way to fight back, and it was a way to be confident. To this day now, youth that did get out the vote work starting about 7 years ago, when we say, how do you want to start this conversation? They say, well, we start with get out the vote work, even though they've done tech equity and economic development and everything else. It's because that's where we started our confidence. And I know Alex sees that in his work. And the honor of doing this work is that it doesn't start, it can start today, but most of these conversations, most of these relationships have started decades ago. You don't transform the ability to rethink our systems overnight. And it is these long-lived relationships in institutions that can stand the test of time that's really important. And it's also about our personal stories. And being from Argentina and having to leave during the last military junta, that was really, for me and Keisha, was a little bit, from my side, the spark of the Battle for Democracy Fund. Was, as a child going through that process, I knew I couldn't have my kids live through a devolving democracy, and I had to do something. And so turned to the best organizers I know, and thus the birth of Battle for Democracy Fund. And we see it in Keisha's work, we see it in Alex's work, and there's so many ripple effects from it as well.
Okay. Thank you. Alex?
Yeah, it's funny when you mentioned that, Derrick. As soon as you started mentioning those years, I started cringing, especially in the 50s, because I think about so much of the voter suppression that was going on for Black Americans at that time. Now, granted, Derrick, we can talk all day about what I've seen and would not seen around the 50s, but but just to know about a lot of the education and being educated around that, I feel like we're living in a time where we're being affected by what's been happening of those times. I always tell people, how do you expect a lot of Black people to have such of our finances in the way that it should be, and our wealth or our education the way it should be, when you spend 400 years telling us that we can't read or write, but now you want us to be at a level where you're suppressing for 400 years. Like, if you kept me from voting for 400 years, there's so many people who have sacrificed their lives just for us to be able to have the right to vote. And we're at a point where now we're seeing the effects of telling people don't go vote, but then you want us to go out and vote now after 40 years, told me not to. I think, sorry about that, guys. My daughter was calling me, excuse me for that. But so that's always been like, one of the things that always came across my mind. But what I've noticed that throughout history, has always been young people who always was on the forefront of any change in our society. If you think about the SNCC movement, they were all young people who were fighting for the rights of just Black people. And they were all young. And we can go into Michael Stokely Carmichael, we go into Martin Luther King started. They were all young. Huey P. Newton, they were all young when they started doing these things. And that always told me that the voice and the power in our community for change starts with young people. And with our organization, that's why we believe in the drive, the creativity, and the opportunities, the potential that young people have if we just give them a space to have their voices heard, a space where they actually create projects on their own, and for them to actually understand the importance of voting in elections in their city and how they can be a part of that change. And we're glad to see this, but also see that we're not the only ones doing it. The work that Alejandra is doing and Keisha is doing, it's like we're all understanding where we all can we have our parts and where we can see those changes. I believe it starts with young people, and we also have to start making more attention of local elections that we do with these federal elections. Right now, you guys see, I voted today because right now we're going through our local elections, but I'm noticing that a lot of the money that we received last year came because of this big presidential election. There was so much money given to organizations to get the vote out, and all of a sudden now that it's over, there's no money for local elections. Now, I'm not going to say there's not enough money that is being sent out as much as it was during the presidential election. These are the things that needs to change. We're to be more concerned about local elections like we do with our presidential elections, knowing that the local ones have more effect on us. But that's the things that I'm seeing. But I really believe it's our young people that's going to be the key to all this, to this change that we need to see in our community.
Thank you, Alex. Michael, Alejandra, Keisha, and Alex are doing all these efforts, and to come right off of Alex's point, these are coming at a time of great demographic change nationally. Part of which we saw in the Georgia elections, and so for centuries, literally, the right to vote by people of color, women until the early 20th century, white women, and was barrier after barrier after barrier kept getting, no matter what the fight was, the forces of restriction kept raising more barriers. And we are seeing that even now. The forces that did not want to see the current administration go into office, the forces that did not want to see Warnock and Ossoff win their senatorial elections and flip Georgia, at least temporarily, to a quote blue state, went right to work the very next day. And the majority of states in this country are contemplating and enacting restrictions. So in that context, what are you seeing as far as how long can this game of raising barriers against a rising multicultural America go on?
That's a great question. Well, thank you, Derrick, and thank you everyone for being here today. It is the question and the anticipation that some point will come where we will no longer engage in these battles, I think misplaces the context in some sense, right? So democracy is a constant struggle. And I think your quote from Du Bois lays that out, right? I mean, this is a recurrent struggle for power, and ultimately the power of democracy as a type of collective decision making and a type of regime is its dynamism, right? It allows people to continue that struggle and to set things straight when they've gone too afar. And so, what I'm most struck by, you mentioned Baldwin's code, right? This is 1980. So this is 15 years after the Voting Rights Act has passed. And in your discussion about the barriers that have fallen tells us something important about what's going on today. And that's that the rules do matter. The Voting Rights Act was a profound piece, arguably the most important piece of civil rights legislation that this country's ever passed. And it had a profound effect on the number of Black representatives elected in the South, locally and statewide and nationally, and empowering people by breaking down the caste system that had emerged after Reconstruction. Those rules were all displaced once the power of the federal government was put behind undoing those inequities. And so what I gather from this is that you've got to have both. And what is, I think, most important about the sort of work that everyone is doing and that UCS is taking part in is that political science and the science of democracy can point out and measure the inequities and demonstrate what rules work better, but all of that comes only through the fruition of mobilization. And we can put rules in place, but it's going to take both defense, when you look at what's happening across the state legislatures, preventing these captured state legislatures from further restricting the vote with ever more subtle and ever more technological means of just shaving a percent here and a percent there, right? Because in a battleground state, that's all that it takes. And so when you see these rules that are being put into place that just change registration deadlines by a few days, or just change a couple days of early voting, these seem like minor administrative things, but they make a difference, and they make enough of a difference to actually determine who holds power in state legislatures and in DC. And so we've got to play defense. We've got to also play offense, and we've got to do better, because one thing that I think Baldwin's comments highlight is the fact that the victories that we have won over the last decades, and particularly seeing this regression, part of which you're absolutely right, part of which is a reaction to the demographic changes that we are seeing, and the United States being on the verge of being a country where no racial or ethnic group has a majority. That's part of it, but it's also part of this longer game that Du Bois saw, right? It's part of keeping those without power unable to address their concerns. And so when we're talking about the quality of people's lives and the role of democracy there, this attempt to restrict voting, this attempt at gridlock, is itself a policy agenda. Because if you can keep people out of power, you can keep them from having a voice and demanding what they deserve, not what they want, but what they deserve. And that's where I think we're at.
Yeah. Keisha, you've had the fortune, or depending on the political fortunes, misfortune of you've worked in my home state of Wisconsin, and now you've gone on to Ohio, both states that have been exceptionally among the most volatile states politically in the last 10 years. Both states went for Obama, and then both states, in 2016, both states went for Trump, and of course, and both states, like most states in the United States, have the unending conflict between urban interests and suburban rural interests, which have been basically gerrymandered in the majority of states with that kind of composition, to where a conservative legislature runs the show in general over the interests of the cities. So where you sit, and without even saying it, I mean, that means voter suppression. So how have you, in Wisconsin, Ohio, what concretely have you been able to do with your forces on the ground to fight, voter suppression efforts?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Derrick. So I'll say my years in Milwaukee were a pleasure and an honor and a joy. I enjoyed.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, the work we did there. And so when Alejandra talked about the Battle for Democracy Fund, the vision behind that fund is an idea of lifting up the on-the-ground work that's been happening for decades in an organization in Milwaukee called Common Ground, in Cleveland, an organization called Greater Cleveland Congregation, that's a part of a network of organizations called the Industrial Areas Foundation. And so the work of really identifying leaders that are committed to being a part of a collective is my everyday work. And so, for example, when we were in Wisconsin, one of the things we did in 2012, because there were moneyed people that actually took out billboards that they put in North Milwaukee, which is where most of the African Americans live, regardless of whether they're middle class or living in poverty, to say that if you're a felon and you vote, it's against the law. And so what we did is we developed a campaign called Vote to Vote, Go to Vote, Get to Vote. And we had 300 leaders that picked selective polling places to make sure if people went to vote, they actually got to vote. Because in Milwaukee, you can actually register the day of and vote. So that was a very clear strategy there. And Ohio this year, our Board of Election, so in Ohio, if you want to vote absentee, you have to fill out an application. And there were multiple applications that people received in the mail, which created a lot of confusion. There were about 30,000 people that got that application rejected. Now remember, this is in the middle of the pandemic. And so Greater Cleveland Congregation was able to organize 289 people to actually follow up with those thousands of people to let them know that their ballot application had been rejected, and that and these people lived in Parma, they lived in Cleveland. We're a nonpartisan organization, so it wasn't about party for us. It was really about participating in democracy. And so we were able to get over 7,000 people to notify about the applications changed so they could actually vote by mail. And so we have leaders that are thinking, monitoring, imagining how do we continue to preserve our democratic space and developing ways for people to participate in our democracy. So that's what we're doing on the ground, and we're going to continue to do that work.
Was that door to door or by email or all?
Which one?
The effort you just mentioned.
Oh, so the crazy thing was, it was phone calls. So we called people.
With landlines? Still with landlines?
Yeah, with landlines or cell phones. We actually did door hangers as well. Like we, people had PPE, so masks and gloves, and they did knock on doors. They did put door hangers on. We did phone calls and emails because there were some people that had their email addresses. And so, yes.
Alejandra, same question to you.
Well, I love this question. Thanks so much, Derrick. And what I love about Keisha's story, right, is that what's behind it is this partnership that we've had with UCS, that we've not been able to have the data behind identifying those 30,000 without having worked with Andy and Michael on these issues. And what's critical about that is process and data can be used as a tool against us. And a lot of times, especially in the Latino community, like, you know, it's hard to track them down, or people think about a white model of get out the vote that does not work with our community. Like, for example, every time we have a get out the vote, we have a party, we have tamales, we have Coke. We really we do it to our culture. And I think what's amazing about that is it's these conversations that makes it really possible when people feel comfortable, there's this opportunity to engage in democracy in a way they really haven't been able to. And I think all of that started really was with this question of common values, right? Even in a nonpartisan lens, it's like, how are we moving forward together? And it was conversations we started with UCS of, as opposed to data driving this, what does it look like for these really kind of unsung organizers on the ground to be leading the entire process, and data to be at our side, kind of like a partner and really getting our back, as opposed to, I think, what's the understanding, which is usually backwards. And I would also say, living in a rural island and having organized get out the vote in a rural island, I think there's this, because your first question was about like this urban suburban divide. I don't know that much about the suburban piece, but living in a rural place, especially Latino community, we are in a lot of rural locations. But no one ever talks to us. You know, we get no pieces of mail saying, hey, Alejandra, we really want your vote. We're just not seen as the most efficient voter to go after, or whatever other structures are in place that keep us from voting. So a lot of times it's about this conversation. And when you start the conversation, I'd say there's a lot less jadedness, a lot more eagerness for action. And so I think the Latino community can increasingly be this leverage point in rural locations to really start thinking about what are our common values together? How are we engaging in democracy together? And I think that's also where, you know, the partnership with UCS is really critical, because if you think about what Michael and Keisha were able to take action on together, that was one county. There's 88 counties in Ohio. Could you imagine if we had the ability to go after the process limitations, not even the outright suppression, just the process glitches? That's 30,000 times 80. You know, the possibilities are endless of what could happen.
Before I lose the thought, Alejandra, when you talk about unsung folks on the ground, give us a picture of one. Talk to us about one of those, one or two of those kind of people.
Well, I think we have one or two of those kind of people on this call. I think, I've seen
Yeah.
Keisha do it forever. I'm sure, Alex too. It's these conversations, right? It's these relationships. It's taking the time to really think about connections and the richness and the myth busting that happens with that, because then it's really engaging leaders. Like, we're not one person, we're an organizer that's activating hundreds, thousands of leaders. And we don't talk about that a lot, And so the ability to not talk about that, it's this gem we're really hiding. And I'll give you like a quick example. When I was doing Get Out the Vote work with the Latino community, we were going around and we have this very different model. We don't just knock up and say, hey, we want your vote. We knock up and we say, hey, like so-and-so said we should talk to you, long conversation, what's going on with work? Your kids, you see the kids kind of milling around their legs. Ay, pero quién es eso, right? And then we start having these conversations, and in these conversations, they're like, pero Alejandra, don't worry. People before you came around and they told me not to vote on federal elections, that we as immigrants are not allowed to vote on federal elections. I was like, ay, pero who told you that? And then we went through and talked to everybody, and we're like, ay, pero your neighbor told us that that's not possible. And it's in these richer conversations that you don't get at the fancy, what's making the news in terms of voter suppression and depression, but the really insidious little pieces that are happening all the time that keep people from voting.
Wow.
And
Thank
it's
you.
Keisha and Alex and the conversations we have at doors where we don't just say we're here for one thing, we're here for you, we're here for your family from here on out. That makes the difference.
Alex, you want to, from your perspective, and I wonder also with a little bit of additional question of, for younger voters, what's the resonance for older voters? Voter suppression is decades in the formation of what that means in our mind. What does that mean for younger voters, or does it mean anything at all?
It's funny because we're working with young people who can vote and those who aren't even able to vote. So we work to 16 to 24-year-olds. So you have a bunch where you have those who didn't care about voting. So we had to do a whole explanation on why. But then you also have these young people like Raven Brown. She's honestly, no, she's 14. She's actually a freshman in high school. And she watches CNN more than any of you guys on this call right now at 14 years old. She will tell you who's running when, why, how, and she's only 14 years old. So is it people like Raven that you want to cultivate and uplift and give her spaces where she can actually elevate this passion that she has? She's so into government and voting, but she's never touched it in her life. Wow. So I've been knowing her since she was in 4th or 5th grade. So I was eager to finally get her in a space to do something. So for us was training them, and we're trying to do this during a pandemic, because as soon as the pandemic hit, we had to cut programming. So we finally we had to shift to virtual. So we created all of our curriculum and lesson plans around, we did government one-on-one with them. We had them watch the documentary 13th Amendment. If you haven't watched that, I would really encourage you guys to watch that. One of my good friends is actually on there. So we had them come and speak to them since it was virtual. It was easy for them to come on and do that. But yeah, it was just giving them interactive, engaging ways to understand the importance of government and voting a lot, because it's so seldom that they're speaking about it in school anyway. And so we first gave them the whole government one-on-one training. And then from there, we're like, well, let's get them actually doing some projects around this. So they created something where I'm disrupting the way that people do canvassing. We decided to do what we're calling placemaking canvassing, where instead of going to door to houses, obviously because it's COVID, we didn't want to do that too. We decided to take a space that was burnt down during the riots that went off after George Floyd's murder. We actually took one of the spaces that was destroyed and repurposed it into a space where it was a lot of traffic there. So we created what we call a green wall, and ask these questions to the community. And they actually ask about violence, racism, where they think extra money to the community should go towards. And so you had these community members who came up, COVID, and obviously everything was COVID safe, but We literally had them go and they were answering these questions that these young people came up with. And then we bought a little pop-up shootout game just to get people registered to vote. It was, how do you make voting canvassing fun? Because people do not like to see people with the clipboards come to you. I'm the kind of person who come with the clipboard. I got my phone to my hand, like, I don't know you guys, like, you stay away from me. But if you see signs where you can come and answer questions and have a little basketball where we can just shoot around, and, you know, we gave people face masks at the end. That was our first toll. So it was amazing just have these kids get to talk to community members, hear how they feel about what everything was at their time, and actually understand, teach them why they should go vote, especially seeing these kids do it and having them say thank you to these kids for doing this was amazing. And then we did this huge, big phone and text banks where we actually got 30 young people to come to one of our urban farms, and like literally they got to go through a whole big 4 or 5 phone and text banks, and they got to reach 85,000 Philadelphians through that whole time, a period between mail-in ballot voting to get out to vote, early registration, I'm getting a mail-in ballot. So we were doing all of this stuff. And when Pennsylvania actually, you know, I don't want to get into the whole political side of things, but us becoming a blue state after being red, you know, for the Trump, it was a win for Pennsylvania, far as the fight of what Pennsylvania wanted. And our kids, we had to make sure they realized that they put a lot of work in contributing to this. And that was the biggest thing, making sure these kids realize that. And I'm sorry, I'm young people. I'm getting better at that, I promise. But it was showing them that this wasn't just we paid them too, so they got to be paid for this experience, but it wasn't just a job. Like, you guys are really contributing to amazing things, not only for your resumes, but just for the contribute to society in our country. So Aurora Raven now has an amazing resume. So when she decided that she wants to take this on for a career, I mean, at 14, and what I just explained, like, she's already set, and that was just for 1 year. So it's just giving them the space and the platform and creativity to actually show that you can drive change, gain job skills, and actually see this as a career. So, you know, it's the way that not only we're seeing this as stuff needs to be done for the neighborhoods and the community, but for ourselves and a civic duty, but there's jobs, so many jobs in here, and our young people can now see these opportunities in this. Why can't our young people be the ones who are running for city council one day, or state rep, or senator, or president? I've got Raven's eye on presidency, mark my words. I'm hoping one day, you know, but it's just creating that ideas like, you guys can do this. So I know I said a lot there, but yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, Michael, it sounds like we're hearing a lot about the future of how the vote gets put out.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a beautiful and transformational story, right? And we have stories like that in so many communities. I think Philadelphia is an especially poignant story when you consider what we know from the election, right? So you look at all the work we just heard about happening in that city to transform our democracy, to build citizens, really, you know, build citizenship, and look at the way that Philadelphia specifically was attacked during the election, the way that the votes were processed and the challenges that were made. That's the battle that we're in, and that's what we have to be thinking about when we look 2 years from now and 4 years from now. And that really, I think, highlights the importance of not allowing the state legislatures to enact these restrictions on eligibility, on ballot access, and on the way that the votes are counted. And so therein lies the work. And even there, we're just talking about procedural and administrative changes. We're not talking about more structural reforms. So ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to vote by mail or in person, regardless of what state they live in. The opportunity to be registered without having to jump through a bunch of these hurdles. And ultimately, I think we've got to talk about the sort of truncated representation that you know, both Du Bois and Baldwin talked about. What is your vote worth? One of the reasons why young people don't see democracy working for them and don't see the role that citizens play is because oftentimes votes literally don't count. So even if you go through all the work of casting a ballot and making sure that your eligibility is there, you often are in a state or in a city with an uncompetitive election where there really is no political competition, or you're in a state such as Pennsylvania, or other battleground states where the boundaries are so gerrymandered that the bias comes after all the votes are counted. So even after the votes are counted, the distribution of one's vote, the value of your vote doesn't count the same as your fellow citizens. And we've got to change that.
You know, one thing that was very striking about the Georgia election, and to some, also to a certain degree, the national election in 2020, was the percentage of quote young environmental voters, 18 to 29, who voted on with climate change and science as a high priority, or among the highest of priorities for for why they got out there to vote. What are you hearing? And you can even make it a conversation at this point, panelists. Is what are you hearing from the younger voters who are going to be voting long after us, and what is going to motivate them, especially in like midterms, where usually there's a dramatic drop off, and in local elections that don't involve presidential, because obviously an issue like climate change, for instance, is really not at this point, unfortunately, it's not really done at the national level. Climate change is really being done state by state, and it adds up to something that then the federal government, if you have a receptive administration, then latches onto, like California's air standards and New England's greenhouse gas initiative and so forth. And also the states now with offshore wind, that really wasn't a national thing. Biden is now jumpstarting it, and was created by state markets. So how do you keep your voters, all these young folks who you've gotten them really motivated to for this basic thing of getting, say, a very negative situation removed? Now, how do you keep them motivated for the quote positive things? Energy, climate, etc.
Yeah, I'll say, so for us in Cleveland, part of what we are starting to do is really engage young people, not just to come out and do service, like cleaning up lots and those things, but to have conversations about, what's keeping them up at night? What do they want to see change in their communities? And for them to be a part of coming up with ideas for that they want to see locally and on the ground. And so one of the things that we're starting to do in Cleveland is neighborhood organizing. So our Battle for Democracy Fund is our way to fund our on the ground work. And so we have a campaign called Battle for Democracy. And it's really about engaging people from 15 on up, so that we're trying to infuse this sense of what does it mean to participate in democracy and to be active about what are the problems and concerns in our community. And then understanding, as Michael said, that whoever writes the rules matter, because we're a very law-driven community. And so we think we have to start young. I think the other part that when Alex talked about SNCC, and it was a sense of voluntary places like nonprofits, congregations, libraries, where people come and congregate. And that those kinds of, I'll use the word institution, like even for millennials, I might be like, we're not a part of institutions. When I worked in the Northwest, it's like, there's not a lot of churches, but lots of labor unions, lots of nonprofits. And so that those kinds of organizations become really pivotal in creating the space to create agency and change, not just to be involved with charity and service, but really looking at issues of justice and injustice, and then learning the skills of organizing to create real change. And so that's something that we're starting to be more intentional about, of creating that next generation of active, participatory people in our democracy.
You know, I would add something to what Keisha said. I think that's right. But I also think that's interesting from having an environmental health background. Uh, Democracy and climate change have something in common in that they're not tangible to most people. They're not tangible to the people I work with who are overworked and barely getting paid. And so the question is like, there's nobody at home going, oh God, I have such a headache over this climate change issue, or democracy is just really getting me today. Not the people I work with, right? They have housing pressures, they have job pressures. And so the question for me is, yes, it is about this climate change conversation. But what I think is the crux, certainly have seen it with the youth I work with. I know Alex has even more stories on this. I know Keisha's seen this with the adults we organize with. It's the question of who's leading, right? And is science in service to the community, right? And so I'll take this even, so after we did this get out the vote work, our Latino youth from the very beginning of this pandemic, like jumped in, the older youth were mentoring the younger youth, so on and so forth. And the vaccine became this question for them, right? There was a lot of back and forth about myths and things like that. And rather than us taking this role of saying, but that's not right, we said, okay, those are great questions. We know some people at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Let's have these questions. Let's have you lead. Let's have you tell us what it looks like to talk about the vaccine. And our youth in particular they created this like infographic with the Union of Concerned Scientists that was all about their ideas. Like it was absolutely, and they felt this power, right? This idea that, yeah, they are in the lead. And that's what we always tell them, like, we're here in the back to get you. Like, let us figure out the process to just get your ideas out in front. And so, yes, climate change weighs on my boys and it weighs on everybody else because it feels overwhelming. So the question is, how do you start with the pathway to leadership and power? And that, I think, is a common link between democracy and climate change.
Alex, Michael, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about a lot of our young people that I've even just to speak with. And Alejandra, you started talking to us about our leaders. And it's like, I also understand them putting together the leader to sorry for the noise in the back, but that be compared to the actual position that leader's holding and what their role is and the responsibilities. It's sort of like that thing where unless you know you're eating chicken, would you eat it? The same thing, like your majority of people don't know who their city council person is, let alone what the role of the city council person is. And so I feel like that basic education, putting two and two together, I feel a lot of times the city council person will come around in a fancy suit in the neighborhood and like, oh, that's an important person. They are city council such and such. Oh, but what do they do? I don't know. I just know they're city council such and such. So it's like, how do we do the basics of educating everyone? Let's think about government is very complicated, very complex. I'm just glad I studied politics in school. Otherwise, I would not understand how much of the system it really is. So there's got to be like that basic understanding of what these roles and systems are and who does what.
Yep. I think Alex froze for a minute. You with us, Alex, by audio? Well, we're waiting for Alex to come back. Michael, do you have a thought on what the three of them were saying?
Yeah, I think there is this continual challenge that we have with big problems, right? That they are abstract, that it's not always easy to make that personal connection. At the same time, I think that one reason why youth historically tend to be leaders in social movements is because for them that abstraction is not there's nothing abstract about what you're seeing happening across states right now, right? I mean, people recognize that their voting rights are being targeted. There's certainly nothing abstract about climate change in California. If you're a teenager in California, you're quite familiar with the effects of climate change because we're living it, right? And so, and it takes me back to the civil rights movement in the 60s and the 50s, the kids that were leading those movements in Mississippi and Alabama, they knew they had a personal connection with the threat to their lives if they dared to register to vote and to actually try to vote. And so I think that that's one reason why youth are so important, and we can bolster that, right? I mean, it's always going to be the youth. And frankly, political power is something that is never yielded. It is always taken. It has to be taken, and you've got to show up. And so I'm frankly optimistic, not just because of the fantastic stories that we're hearing today, but seeing this come to fruition. We are starting to see younger people running for office, for local office, and for state and federal office. We're seeing that generational transition start to develop, and it's in large measure because of the type of work that Alex and Keisha and Alejandra are doing, but it's also part of this larger movement where, again, it's this never-ending game. Whereas there are new modes of voter suppression, new modes of passive voter suppression. The very style that campaigns operate in have a tendency to focus on high propensity voters and the like. And what we're figuring out now is how to overcome those inequities and to change the name of the game and the type of relationships we're building.
Yeah. Let me go ahead, Keisha.
In Cleveland, for the first time in a long time, there's a mayoral and council races coming up this summer and fall, and every council district is contested. So that's a real change, and the current mayor is not going to be running again, and so there's going to be a potential new mayor of Cleveland and possibly new council members. And these are, so I'll give you an example. Ward 1, the current councilman won by 9 votes. 9 votes. So when you start talking about, and you can kind of look at these numbers, the gaps are maybe 25 or 30 or 9, that it really does matter on the local level, who votes, who doesn't. And in the communities, one of the things that we're seeing that it's not about voter registration, because there's a pretty, like, voter registration has gone up in Cuyahoga County. What's gone down is voter participation. So even in these districts where you have a lot of people registered, you only have a fraction of those people voting. And so we think, that's the real space of participatory democracy that we're talking about. And what do people want to see in their communities? And that the council people, the mayor, have direct ability to direct money and resources and policies that impact your neighborhood. And so you build on that, and then you begin to expand those concentric circles. So that's one of the parts that we're seeing and doing here.
Yeah. Alex, sorry, I'm glad you're back. Is there anything you wanted when you finish up on from when you were on?
Yeah, Derrick, honestly, sometimes I believe that, Big Brother shut me off because what I was about to say, but that's a whole other conversation for another day, but I'm gonna challenge it anyway. One of the things that I have been listening from our young people is how do we reimagine our party system? And we think about science, and I think always thinking about the theory of change. I'm just thinking about theories, and our young people are questioning this. It's like, when I think Keisha brought this up before about like how, 1 minute, it was the Republicans that freed the slaves. All of a sudden now majority of Black people are Democrats now. So there's this switchover, and obviously we go into why the switchover is, but when we talk about these things with them, they're questioning of the whys, and you got to be like, that's politics, but there's a deeper meaning behind it. But this us reimagining how we're doing our political party system is another thing that they've brought up, and has been something that's been in my mind too. But just listen to them, is something that we should, when we talk about science and government, I've always thought about that. It's like, our government didn't start off with a 2-party system. I know we're here now, but I feel like there's some things that we should just be reimagining. That's one of the biggest things. That and campaign financing.
Derrick, can I add just one more thing about youth? Because
Sure.
I know that Alex and I both have, even though I came very late into youth organizing, when I tell people that Keisha and I organized during the Obama administration, my youth are always like, you were doing this way back then? You are so old. But what I love about the youth, and like in this conversation I had with some of Keisha's youth in Cleveland, they're just optimistically angry. You know, they're not deflated. They're ready to do something. They still think you can restructure everything, right? And we have, like in my experience in my family, like the school to prison pipeline, which I like to call the school to prison slip and slide. You get one toe out of line, you're done. That's your life. Right? Like, and so what I see, like what we see, like Keisha and I are looking at, like, what's the school to organizing pipeline? How do you get all this wonderful, optimistic anger and bring it into restructuring and completely reimagining our communities? Like that's the ability of what youth can bring into the mix here. And I just really quick story about like one of the youth that I work with, right? That when this last administration happened, there was a real peak in racism against Latinos in his school, started getting in a lot of fights, started getting suspended a lot. And we had this conversation because, you know, I knew his mama, and I was just like, well, what's another way to pack a punch? And he ended up being the leader of our GOTV work. And he and his other friends like did a sit-in, refusing to leave our first phone bank, saying it was more fun than video games. Right. And fast forward 3 months later, that same school that was frankly, you know, suspending him at a higher rate than other kiddos was doing a you know, assembly to honor him. Yeah. So like, who else are we not lifting up? Like, what is the opportunity here? So I just get really excited about their optimistic anger.
Well, to play on your optimistic anger, I am wondering, are we seeing, and I'm thinking about Wisconsin, when the Republican, you know, the conservative legislature basically forced people to go vote in the primary back in a year ago in the spring. And people got out there, even at the risk, at that time, the very unknown risk of contracting COVID, and changed some aspects of how the state government is including the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court. Are we seeing, because of the events of the last 3-4 years, police brutality, a prior administration that wanted to roll back the clock on a whole host of things? Are we seeing in the people you work with, young voters, a new definition of what power is, or a redefinition of power, or a clearer definition of power? And I ask that question because as Baldwin, as Du Bois, and many of people, you know, my age used to say, like, you go on the street, I don't know if my vote means anything. And the folks you work with are not saying that. You're calling it an optimistic anger. So is that optimistic anger another way of getting at the notion of a redefinition of what power means, a clear enough definition to go out and fight for it, no matter what the obstacles are being placed in the way of the voting booth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, we talk about in our work, the power is simply the ability to be able, and that it comes in two forms: organized people and organized money. And I think that what we're seeing is this real understanding of organized people, which is something that, you know, we experienced in the 1960s and the mass organization. What we missed in the teaching of those experiences, that it was also organized money. So like when you look at the Montgomery bus boycott, we tell the story of Rosa Parks, but we miss that we don't teach that she was a part of a collective, right? That was organizing and experimenting with how do you take down this monster, this evil of desegregation, right? And that they were able to organize the taxi drivers and the gas stations, and the taxi drivers, the Black taxi drivers charge 10 cents, the same as the buses. They organized almost like $1.1 million. And so I think that for me, what I'm seeing as this resurgence of really understanding the role that organized money plays in creating change, and that when we do our work, we're talking about people organizing, which we see that in the streets, but you also got to understand how we organize our money. And I think that when the leaders that we talk to, whether kids or even older people, when they make that connection, because we see what the corporations do, they organize their money for policy and for change. And a lot of us in the nonprofit sector, we're just kind of playing the game a little bit. And so like, I'm starting, just to see that agitation, like, wait a minute, we have to really understand power. We have to understand how we organize our people and our money so that we can aim it and focus it to get real lasting change.
Yeah. So like, how much did it cost to do the campaign for mail-in ballots?
That we did as GCC cost for us?
Yeah.
What was our budget? So we have a budget, right? So our organization, I think in some ways is unique. I talked about this network I'm a part of. We're a dues-based organization. So we have 36 congregations that pay dues. And then we have individual donors. We have some foundation money. And then, so what is our budget? I think our budget is about $500,000. But we did it on a shoestring, right? Like, there's other people that get like way more money than we do and have like significantly less like production. So I don't know if that answered your question, because it kind of made me blush a little bit. I'm like, what?
No,
but it's like our dues, because like part of our understanding of building like Greater Cleveland congregations is that we have to have our own money, and so that we can be independent. We're nonpartisan, so we don't endorse or oppose candidates. We are clear that Ohio is a third Republican, a third independent, and a third Democrat. And so if we're really going to be a part of change, we have to cut issues in a way that appeal to people's like real self-interest, not just partisan politics. So we do a lot of work on a little bit of a budget.
Can I jump in? Because I think Keisha's being like super modest. Miracles on pennies,
Right.
Transforming lives, creating stories. And this is what happens when you're on the ground organizer. You're not going up and doing like a flashy marketing campaign. You're just doing the work. You're with community every day. And that means you have less resources. What we could do to like fold that out is amazing. And to your question about power is that I think one of the interesting things that's happening right now, and last thing on the funding, like just for the Latino communities, all nonprofits get 1.8% of all philanthropic dollars. Right. And part of that is this is part of what's really interesting about this UCS partnership is that sometimes they're just distressed by people of color led organizations. And so when we partner with the Union of Concerned Scientists with all this data and everything like that, I think it brings in a really refreshing piece of we're doing the critical work, which again, I think is the most important work, the relational work on the ground. And here we have like, a PhD in like the statistical background of voter suppression helping us through these other pieces, even though we're a smaller group. And that's the power of it. The last thing I'll say about power is that reframing. We're getting people to run for office right now that would never run for office because there was like, oh, my kids are like, I don't see myself that way. And we're just reframing. It's not about one person running. It's about the community running. And everything we say is framed in that way. Everything we do is about our collective power.
I would add to that as well, just to pick up on a point that Alex made earlier and Keisha spoke to in the context of Cleveland. One of the things that I see most clearly looking at the reform groups that I've worked with is the young people do not have the deference to the given party structure that we have. And I think that that's a really important point to make. And it was true for the Democratic Party in the 60s. Let's not forget what the Democratic Party was in the South. It was the party of white supremacy, and it took those activists and organizers to start putting forward their own delegations and taking control. And that's the sense that I get from youth voters today, is that the idea that we have to accommodate, let's think of what has happened over the last 50 years. We still have a two-party system that functionally accommodates a white nationalist movement. And it was in the Democratic Party, and now it's in the Republican Party. And we've got to rethink, and I think young voters are doing this. We don't have to accommodate white nationalism as a political culture anymore, and we need to cordon it off. And that means that we need a broader party system. I'd go further to say that the idea that all non-white voters can have their views and their voices heard in one party is fairly absurd. We are the only true two-party system that operates like this in the world, and it makes no sense. And I think younger voters recognize that, and so they're looking towards those broader structural reforms that will open up our party system as well.
Yeah. Right. Well, coming into the home stretch of this session, thanks for all the comments and everything. What for the listeners and the viewers out there, what can they do beginning right now to ensure the vote, whether that is super long-term grassroots or pointing specifically to the midterms in 2022 and so forth. And I can speak from my wife back in 2016, went out and was part of the canvassing of Pittsburgh. And she decided, I'm going to take a week off, go to Pittsburgh and hit the ground. And Pittsburgh held the same margins of voters that voted for the departing president, number 44, and held the same margin for him as it did in 2012. That did not happen in Philadelphia. Philadelphia lost about, if I recall correctly, Alex, Philadelphia lost about 150,000 votes from 2012 to 2016. So what can the person listening here, how can they be involved with either your campaigns or just in general in their wherever they live to not be a armchair politician?
You nailed it. I mean, honestly, as I'm hearing a lot of people in the chat, I hear a lot of experts sharing these things. It doesn't do no justice talking to the same people all the time. Volunteer your time. Like, honestly, I'll be honest with you, like the same people I'm seeing these comments from are the same people who know a lot, but I'm like, I'm gonna challenge you guys to volunteer your time, partner with a number of us. I'm not going to speak on for Keisha and Alejandra, but we'd love to find out ways that we can have partnerships. And one of the things we talked about too is like funding. This is serious. Like our work that we're working with, there are times where money will hit around voter election times that it doesn't. But if you have access to funding to support the work that we are doing, these organizations that you see on the call, please support us with your work. There's a lot of things. I don't have the time to go over all of them. I'm just explaining two of these, but there's a lot of resources that are on this call, and I'm going to challenge you guys to not talk to your colleagues and your other expert buddies. Challenge yourselves to educate other people that you normally wouldn't talk to. Find yourselves to do things you normally would not do to really make these changes that we need. This is a serious time, and I feel like there's way too much power. Like Keisha even mentioned that, some of that is on this call, on this webinar, and I'm going to challenge you guys to leverage that power to help out those in need, especially I'm in need, so I'll definitely love to get as much help and support from these things. So definitely challenge yourselves to do things you guys normally don't do, and let's really come together to fight for the good right of our country. So I'll say that at the very least. Derrick.
Yeah, so for us, the Battle for Democracy Fund, we actually will be doing, for those that are interested in learning more about the on-the-ground work that we're doing in Ohio and Wisconsin, we are going to have a briefing for folks to get deeper. So one, you could come and learn more. Underscore what Alex said of supporting funding. That's always, a key piece for individual donors for our work. The other part is that we're always looking for organizers. So if you're a scout and you have people that really want to learn this craft of organizing, we're always looking for talent. And so that's another thing that we would love for people to do. And the final thing is that, yes, we have key elections coming up in our states, both in 2022 with 2 senators that are retiring, and lots of questions about what's going to happen. And so we will be doing on the ground work. And so there will be opportunities for that. We've committed to, in Cleveland, a 10-year campaign to really make our state competitive and to create this space where we as the people are really helping to drive the policies and the participation, and to see if we can really get voter participation to increase instead of continuing to decrease in multiple counties throughout our state. And so that's another strategy that we're working on.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I love that, and I get to witness every day what Keisha's doing and what we're doing together and what we're building. And I think it's exciting. I mean, you want to be part of it. And at this point, we're looking not just for allies, but for accomplices, people who are ready to get in the fight with us. One way to do that is when you're thinking about supporting democracy, look for those actually working closest to the ground, create relationships there, support their work. Because it's actually these groups, right? Like Alex's group and Keisha's group and the work we do with the Latino community that have these long-term relationships and are not just about the transaction of voter, of like getting one vote every 4 years, because voter suppression is not built every 4 years. It's built over 4 years. It's built over 10 years. That's why, Keisha's running a 10-year campaign. And, the work that Alex is doing, the work that Keisha's doing, and with the data support from Michael, Keisha and I are creating a blueprint for not just stopping suppression, but also stopping voter depression, which is one that's not really discussed, which is there's just so many barriers to vote. You're constantly working 3 jobs. Like, again, it's not like, oh, I got to get up extra early because democracy's bugging me today. And the only way sometimes that they're going to meet that organizer that's really going to change their lives, that's going to change their community, might be your support.
Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that there's a role for everyone to play, right? So even if organize, everyone can be an organizer and everyone should be an organizer, but there are, plenty of people on this call, I'm sure, that have other skills that they can contribute. And one of the things that you need to do is be part of the process. People can be part of the electoral process, not just in terms of mobilizing, but in terms of contributing to the openness and transparency of our democratic system. So making sure that people have the information that they need, making sure that local election officials and state election officials are providing the information that they need to ensure that our elections are transparent. There's a lot of data skills that can be used there, a lot of all sorts of skills for those who have backgrounds in science or science advocacy, to be part of the system of creating and making sure that we have free and fair elections because the information is available. Finally, I would say support smart reforms. One of the things that we're seeing, we're in an era of reform, right? Everyone recognizes that this is not working. There's some fundamental flaws with our democracy. Every time we go through one of these periods, you get a bunch of what I think of as junk reform, right? And a lot of movements that have a lot of money push these reforms that are fundamentally incrementalist or even flawed in that they don't achieve what they promise. And those things are typically easier to pass because sitting legislators are not threatened by them. Support smart reform and support bold reform, because that's what we need. And this is not the time for incrementalism.
Yeah, one last thing, Michael, aside from all the, wisdom that Alejandra, Alex, and Keisha just shared from their efforts in their locales, any other examples around the nation of like amazing grassroots organizing that, people really should be paying attention to?
Oh, absolutely. Certainly this summer and as we go into the fall, for those of you that haven't noticed, we're in a redistricting cycle. So this is where science and activism intersect directly. There are a number of public redistricting projects. Even if your state doesn't have a redistricting commission, doesn't mean that you can't be involved in the process, and you should be. And so there are Michael McDonald's organization, the Public Mapping Project. There are a number of other groups. More Equitable Democracy has a software, and they're training people to learn how to make their own maps, and so that you can become part of that process and be part of who decides how the lines are drawn. That sort of technology is now being democratized so that average citizens and ordinary folks can be a part of the process of determining how they're represented rather than letting legislators decide.
Great. Well, thank you, Keisha, Alex, Alejandra, Michael, for this great discussion. And actually, it was so optimistic for me that it works right into something actually that I'm going to close with Baldwin, and it won't be as depressing because it actually goes to what you all were talking about. You said, talking about voting and being in this country. He says, the irreducible miracle is that we have sustained each other for a very long time and have come a long, long way together. We have come to the end of a language and are now about the business of forging a new one. For we have survived, children, the very last white country the world will ever see. And so with that, thank you, all you listeners and viewers who joined us today. We hope that this was a rich conversation for you, particularly from hearing the word of what's going on from the ground up and not pontifications from the top down. And I wish, Keisha, Alex, Alejandra, the best of luck, especially since, Keisha, you have so much, you're a stakeholder in my home state of Wisconsin. Please keep Wisconsin real.
Oh, yeah.
With that, thank you again to Union of Concerned Scientists for holding the space for this conversation. And I'm going to turn it back to Andy for closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Derrick, Keisha, Alex, Alejandra, Mike, all of you for a really great discussion. There was a lot going on in the Q&A. I have to say I answered for you in some cases. So anybody who asked a question that I answered, don't hold the panelists to it. I did my best. I will say I've learned a lot from all of the panelists in interactions. Mike, Keisha, and I seem to have a meeting every Wednesday night, which has been fun for over a year. And I've learned an enormous amount. Just a few reflections on things I heard. I mean, much of the voter suppression is about white supremacy. It's not about good government. It's not about any of the other, it's not about the security of elections. It's about maintaining white supremacy culture. I think that the strongest theme that we heard from all of the panelists, including Mike as a political scientist, is that both personal experience and relationship building are better than any campaign tactic that can be devised by any pundit or campaign operative on the planet. It's Keisha working with people in her congregations and Alejandra working with people in congregations, but in her communities, and Alex working at a grassroots level with the youth who go home and talk to their parents and talk to their family members and talk to their friends. So that's just a very powerful basis to build towards change. A lot of the questions in the Q&A were, particularly at the beginning, were how does this connect to science? And I think the work that UCS has done with Mike Lattner, and I give great credit to Mike for sort of helping us understand the science of democracy, is that there are significant data resources that are available. And if you analyze these data, as scientists do and should, and you look at the evidence, you can understand both the barriers and then the opportunities to greater democratic participation and greater representation. And so one of the things that we want to do in our interaction with grassroots organizations is bring that capacity to the grassroots work. It's not that UCS is going to, do the grassroots organizing. We have people who are just great at that and are in communities that where organizing has been, critically important for a really long time. But if we can put better data resources in the hands of those organizers, their campaigns become stronger. Their efforts become more robust, and the arguments against the work that they're doing to increase voter participation are put under a microscope, and we can show that they are really lies. And so sometimes I think of this as right now, Alex and Alejandra and Keisha, they're doing enormous work to get people over the wall of voter suppression. There's a barrier there that is intentionally constructed to make it more difficult for certain communities, certain people to vote. It's not difficult for me in Gloucester, Massachusetts. I drive 5 minutes down the road. There's no line in my polling place. What's the big deal? If you have to take 3 buses and you can't get off work and you can't vote and you don't have somebody's proper ID, or you don't have any guidance in terms of what's on a mail-in ballot form, such that you didn't write down your birthday, not because you didn't know it, but because there was a little thing in the corner of the form that said enter your birthday here, and a lot of people missed it. Should you be excluded from voting for that reason, which is exactly what happened in Cleveland last year. So this is an issue where there's a wall and we're trying to help people get over it, but you also have to ask yourself the question, why should there be a wall in the first place? There's no basis for it. There's no reason in our democracy to erect walls for people to vote. It's a constructed narrative that we want to reassure certain parts of the population that the vote is so-called secure. Well, if you tell them it isn't secure, then you can pass laws to make it more secure, even if it's secure in the first place. It's entirely constructed narrative. So there's a lot of these themes that run through the questions that came in. And so the partnership between UCS and grassroots organizations, I think, is something we need to pursue, but it's funding of the grassroots organizations that ultimately will make this more powerful. I'm not arguing against funding for UCS because Natalie would kill me, but that's not the point. The point is that it's funding for the grassroots efforts that becomes critically important, and those dollars are incredibly valuable because they're so scarce. And then finally, I'd say this is not a problem of Black and Latino and Indigenous communities. The rules that are promulgated to suppress the vote are state rules. And we all can vote on state rules, whether you live in an all-white suburb or you live in a mixed area, wherever you live. And it's not just for the Black communities or the Latino communities or other communities of color to overcome these problems. If in fact you think, well, that's not a problem in my district, or even if you think it's not a problem in your state, that's probably not the case. If you live in a place that has strong voting rights rules, then you need to help push for strong rules at the federal level such that other states can't avoid them. If you live in a state that is pushing forward voter suppression rules, you need to hold your elected officials accountable because you are their constituent, whether you voted for them or not. And so there's a lot to do. I encourage you to go to Battle for Democracy Fund website, certainly to the One's Up website, and to the UCS website for different kinds of actions you can take. And with that, I will thank you. Thank all of the panelists once again, and wish you all a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.